Hello, fellow book readers. My name is John, and today we are going to talk about subgenres of fantasy and book recommendations for each one. So, in this video, I am going to go over a bunch of different subgenres for fantasy. Probably not all of them, but a lot of them. And then I'm going to give a book recommendation for each one I go over. I'm going to give a series recommendation and a standalone recommendation for almost everyone. There's a couple where I can't give both because I haven't read enough of that particular subgenre, but I'm going to try to give a series and a standalone for each subgenre. Now, with that being said, these aren't going to be deep dive recommendations. This video is meant for people that are just starting fantasy or that have not read a particular subgenre yet. Maybe you're versed in fantasy but haven't read a particular subgenre yet. So these are going to be well-known books. So yeah, you're going to have heard of the majority of these books, like 90% of them. And I'm just going to pick my favorites from each subgenre, basically. Obviously, I'm not going to do any repeats because obviously in fantasy, books cross subgenres very, very often. So you may see a book in one subgenre and be like, well, no, this belongs in this other subgenre. It's like, well, no, it's really both, or even more than two subgenres. So do keep that in mind. But with that being said, let's start with our first subgenre, and that is high fantasy. Now, high fantasy is a subgenre of fantasy where the entire story takes place in a fictional secondary world. So it doesn't take place on our planet, it doesn't take place on Earth, it takes place in a fictional world with its own people, its own rules, its own geography, its own society. It's not like our planet. And often in high fantasy, the books are going to have a lot of magic in them. They don't have to, but usually there is a lot of magic in high fantasy books. So, the series that I'm going to recommend for a high fantasy is the Earth Sea Cycle series by Ursula K. Le Guin. It is 6 books, 5 novels, and 1 short story collection. It's just awesome. It's like classic high fantasy. I love it. It has a lot of things for everybody. It's coming of age tale, but it's also the second set of books. The characters are of age, like they're older. So yeah, it's a little bit of everything there. It has powerful theming, but the world itself is brilliant. It's this archipelago filled with magic, and it's a bunch of different cultures, and there's dragons. I think the series is the perfect place to begin your high fantasy journey if you haven't already done so. And that leads me out to the standalone. This is, in my opinion, the best standalone of all time. It's inarguable. That would be The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien. Yeah, The Hobbit takes place in its own world, Middle-earth, arguably the best world ever created in fantasy. Has its own race of peoples and cultures and everything else. It's what all fantasy was built on. Definitely check it out. What sets it apart from Lord of the Rings is it's not as grand in terms of the stakes. So that's why it's really not an epic fantasy and it's just a high fantasy. The stakes aren't as high. But yeah, I do think everybody should read it. It's, in my opinion, the best standalone ever created. Okay, next up is epic fantasy. So think high fantasy. It's its own secondary world, its own people, its own cultures, its own rules. It usually has a lot of magic. But the big difference is the stakes are way higher. There's wars usually, battles, grand events are taking place. That is the big difference between epic fantasy and high fantasy. Most high fantasies are epic fantasies, but not all high fantasies are epic fantasies, if that makes sense. Now, the 2 recommendations for epic fantasy for me are going to be pretty easy. Series-wise, it's going to be The Wheel of Time by Robert Jordan. It's a 15-book series, well, a 14-book series and a prequel, but there are 15 books in that world. And the stakes are just so brilliant. Everything about it is brilliant. It's so grand. It all builds to this super climactic moment, but the character work here is superb. It has everything you love about high fantasy in there. Its own people, its own world, its own culture, its own magic, but the stakes are dialed up to 11. So yeah, I do think this is arguably the gold standard of epic fantasy. There's others that you could definitely argue there, but this one neatly fits in epic fantasy without really crossing into too many other subgenres like some of the other grand epic fantasies can and do. So yeah, that's going to be my series recommendation. And then the standalone that I'm going to recommend here is Warbreaker by Brandon Sanderson. This book is everything you like about high fantasy, its own world, its own people, its own culture, a very detailed and cool magic system, but it also has this high stakes looming war that's taking place over the whole story that culminates in like a very epic climax. So yeah, I definitely recommend that. One of my favorite standalones. It's definitely my favorite Brandon Sanderson standalone that I've read so far. Now, I haven't read them all yet. Okay, next up is low fantasy. And low fantasy is just like epic and high fantasy, but there's very little to no magic involved. So it's more real, it's more gritty, it's more human. A lot of times low fantasy takes place on our planet, but not always. Sometimes it takes place on a secondary world. And actually, both of my low fantasy recommendations do take place on a secondary world. So for my series that I'm going to recommend for low fantasy, it would be the Shattered Sea series by Joe Abercrombie. It's a young adult series, but it's Norse inspired, but it's in a secondary world, but there's no magic. Now, magic is alluded throughout the series, but it's not really real. And that's not a spoiler or anything. You'll see that like pretty much right away. I'm going to leave it to you to figure out what it is. I definitely recommend it, especially if you've already read things like The First Law. This is Joe Abercrombie doing something a little bit different. It's a quicker read. Very, very good stuff. I love it. Especially, I'm big into like Norse mythology, and there's a lot of references to that going on in this book. And for the standalone, I am going to recommend The Goblin Emperor by Catherine Addison. The Goblin Emperor takes place on an entirely different world, just like a high fantasy would, but there's almost no magic involved in this story. It's very gritty and real, and it's about our new king coming into power who wasn't supposed to be the king, and how he deals with the politics and everyday court life. There's no big war going on. There's no big like epic quest going on. It's just like a day-to-day life of this new king, and there's really no magic, but there's a lot of political intrigue. And yeah, it's I think a great example of how low fantasy is done right. So I would definitely recommend that if you haven't checked out any low fantasy and you're looking for a standalone. The Goblin Emperor is where it's at. It's great. Okay, the next subgenre we're going to talk about is urban fantasy. Now, urban fantasy is just like high fantasy and epic fantasy. The only difference is it takes place in a modern day world. That world can be either secondary or not secondary, so it can take place in modern day Earth, but it doesn't have to. It can take place in a modern day secondary world, but it has to be modern day. So it has to be based off of like a modern day world or city. Now, the two book recommendations I'm going to have for urban fantasy are for the series The Greenbone Saga by Fonda Lee. This series takes place in more of a modern day inspired Asian city. So yeah, it has like the mafia basically, or the mob, and all sorts of like modern day things you would find in real life, like stores and restaurants and technology. But it also has magic and epic fighting and battles and a looming conflict taking over the whole thing. It's one of the best trilogies I've ever read. It's in my top 3. I think it's the best example of urban fantasy that we have today. So I highly recommend it. And for standalones, this one's a little bit harder for me because I haven't read too many urban fantasy standalones, but the one I'm going to go with is The Book of Doors by Gareth Brown. This was a debut novel. It takes place in modern day New York City, and it follows the life of a bookseller. But the bookseller finds a magic book, and it turns out there's this whole secret society of people collecting magic books. But yeah, it's definitely an urban fantasy. There's a lot of modern day stuff going on in it, and it takes place in modern day New York City. So if you've ever been to New York City, you'll recognize a lot of the places and names that are dropped in the book. Okay, the next subgenre that I want to talk about is Romantasy, the subgenre that is sweeping over the internet the past few years. So Romantasy is any sort of fantasy where the primary plot of the story revolves around a romance. The book would fall apart without said romance. The romance is more important than the plot. So like usually the romance in a lot of fantasy has romance in it. Usually it's the secondary plot and the story can still go on without it. In this case, the romance is really the plot. There may be another plot going on in the background or even like just a little bit to the side. but the romance is the main plot and the main driving force of the story. So, for me, the series I'm going to recommend is The Bridge Kingdom by Daniel L. Jensen. I think this is just like a really masterful piece of like world building going on in here. These books are very good, very entertaining, very exciting. They all have great climaxes. And what I love about the series is 3 separate duologies, and they all focus on like each set of duology focuses on a different set of people and a different kingdom, but they all sort of interconnect at the same time. Yeah, just really great piece of writing, and like I said, I really enjoy the world building here. So if you're somebody who has never read a Romantasy and you're like hesitant to want to go down that genre, it might not be for you. I think this one stays a little bit closer to the fantasy side than some of the others out there, and because of that's the one I'm going to recommend. I also, like I said, I just really like the world building in the series and the climaxes of the books. But I also think, the romances are very good. And for the standalone, I'm going to go with An Enchantment of Ravens by Margaret Rogerson. I really like this book. It's a pretty great standalone. It has everything you like about fantasy in it. Fae. But not like these fae that you see in like other Romantasy books. These fae are very dark and creepy and more like mythological, which I really liked. The setting here is perfect. I think both of our main 2 characters are really great characters, and they carry the book in a lot of different ways. But I also think the antagonist is very good. The fight scenes are very good. And yeah, the romance is also just very good. So yeah, I definitely recommend this one if you're looking to read a standalone Romantasy. This is my favorite one that I've read so far. So the next subgenre we are going to talk about is Grimdark, which is more gritty and morally gray epic fantasy, basically. So in Grimdark, there's often more violence and more bleakness and less hope and just like a less light, basically, in Grimdark fantasy. And oftentimes it's called more gritty and real. I don't know if I would call it more real, but oftentimes it's how it's described. And it usually features morally gray characters as opposed to like bright, hopeful protagonists. The best example of this is in my opinion, is the first really real grimdark book, and that is A Song of Ice and Fire by George R. R. Martin. That's a series I'm going to recommend. He was grimdark before grimdark was a thing. George R. R. Martin basically invented the subgenre when A Game of Thrones was dropped in 1996. Just a great series recommendation. The best morally gray characters I've ever seen. A lot of different plot points going on at the same time, which is often a feature of grimdark books. Just violence and death sprinkled throughout the book, but it doesn't feel like unfair or unrealistic. Really great action scenes and just some really awesome political intrigue, which is also a facet of grimdark. And the standalone that I'm going to recommend is actually one that I'm still in the middle of, but I already know that like this is going to be a great book because I can already tell, and I'm in the middle of reading it right now, and that would be Best Served Cold by Joe Abercrombie. It's part of his first All universe. His second trilogy is just 3 standalones featuring different characters. This is the first one, and it's a revenge story. I think the main character is just amazing. I love a good revenge story, so I love this. And yeah, this series is very, very grimdark. It's violent, and you don't know who's going to live and who's going to die, and every character is morally gray. Okay, the next subgenre we're going to talk about is dark fantasy. People often get grimdark and dark fantasy confused, but they are not the same thing. Dark fantasy is horror fantasy, so it's horror and fantasy sort of mixed together. You can call it horror if you want, but it is still a fantasy. And that's basically it. It's a fantasy that could act as a horror novel if it was not a fantasy. And my biggest series recommendation for this would be Empire of the Vampire by Jay Kristoff. It takes so much inspiration from so many different vampire horror novels, but it's a epic fantasy at its core, with a war between light and dark and good and evil and vampires and humans. And there's a lot of magic there too, but at its core it has a lot of horror stuff going on, and it is very dark, like say a horror movie. But it's not grimdark. Not everybody's a morally gray character It's more like a horror movie that is also a fantasy, if that makes sense. And then my standalone recommendation for this is A Sorceress Comes to Call by T. Kingfisher. This is a classic dark fairy tale, something you would find the Brothers Grimm writing, basically. I love it. Such a great book, but it's definitely skates the line of horror and fantasy, so it belongs in the dark fantasy subgenre. Definitely read this one if you haven't, and trust me, you're going to love it. Okay, the next subgenre I'm going to talk about is one that is sort of just like, I won't say starting, but just like starting to get big, is how I would say it, and that would be lit RPG. It's a subset of fantasy that takes all the elements that you love of fantasy, but it makes it sort of a video game. So there's stat points and levels. I think those are the two like main things you want. But also there's usually nods to certain video games or like television shows. And I've only read one lit RPG, so it's the only one I can recommend. It's also, I really liked it though. And that would be How to Defeat a Demon King in 10 Easy Steps by Andrew Rowe. It's a standalone. It takes really, really heavy inspiration from The Legend of Zelda, Ocarina of Time. So yeah, if you love The Legend of Zelda, and if you love The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, definitely check this one out. It's worth it all the way. It's got great humor, but it has so many nods to the video games, and it has everything that lit RPG readers love, like stat points and levels. So yeah, definitely can't wait to read more lit RPGs, but this is the one that I can recommend, and I do actually really like it. So. Okay, the next subgenre we're going to talk about is magical realism. This is another subgenre that I'm not as dabbled in. I'm more dabbled in it than I am in lit RPG, but not as much. And magical realism generally takes place in the modern day world, and there's just like sprinkles of magic throughout the novel, but you don't actually know if the magic is often real or not. But it's more real than it is in, let's say, low fantasy. Magical realism, sometimes people that read magical realism are a little bit elitist and they don't consider it fantasy, but trust me, it is fantasy. And the novel that I am going to recommend is a standalone by Ewan Ivey called The Snow Child. Obviously, the central plot of this book revolves around the Snow Child herself, who is magical, probably. We don't know at the end if she is for sure, but she is magical, like, let's just put it that way. And yeah, it's just accepted as real by the people in the story. And that's often a trait of magical realism as well. Usually the magic that is present is accepted as real, even though it's minimal and sort of vague. But yeah, other than that, the story could just be any other piece of classic literature. It takes place in Alaska. It's about this couple that is going through some tough times in their marriage, and they are lonely and don't have children, and the setting plays a big role in here. Often magical realism are very atmospheric, and that's the case here. So yeah, I think this is the best example of magical realism that I would ever recommend. I gave this book 5 stars. I love it. Next up is a classic subgenre called portal fantasy. Now, portal fantasy is where characters in the book go from a real world to a different world via usually a portal. And that portal can be very many different things. But yeah, this subgenre of fantasy used to be written a lot more, like back in the 70s and 60s and the 80s. But you don't see as much portal fantasy these days. You see some, but not as much. It's not as mainstream. The first 2 fantasy books I ever read, actually, were both portal fantasies, and I'm going to recommend them both here. So for the series, I am going to recommend Harry Potter. Harry Potter is a portal fantasy. Harry himself steps from real-world England into the magical world through a portal. He goes through platform 9 3/4 to get on the train to go to Hogwarts. He goes through a wall behind a bar to get into Diagon Alley. The wizarding world takes place in our world, but it's different from our world because you have to get there via portals, which is interesting. And then for the standalone, I am going to recommend a more classic portal fantasy, and that would be The Phantom Tollbooth by Norton Juster. This is the first fantasy book I ever read. I love it. I love everything about it. It is a middle grade fantasy, so it is for children, but you can read it as an adult and get so much out of it. The puns in this book are masterful. I think the world is great. I love that our main character just steps into a toll booth and it takes him to a completely fictional world. So good. Okay, the next subgenre I'm going to talk about is also one that I'm not as versed in, and that would be swords and sorcery. Swords and sorcery is exactly what it sounds like. It's fantasy that has big, bold protagonists that use swords and magic to fight enemies. That's pretty much what it is. And the book I would recommend, I'm only going to recommend a standalone here, not a series, is The Hero and the Crown by Robin McKinley. Now, I don't think the protagonist here fits into the general stereotype of a normal swords and sorcery protagonist. Usually they're big, muscular men that are the protagonists of these swords and sorcery novels. Now, our protagonist here is a teenage girl. But the book is very much swords and sorcery. There's tons of people fighting in this novel with swords. Our main character fights with a sword. She does magic. She is basically a sorceress. She learns out. She fights and kills dragons. It is classic swords and sorcery plot. It's just the protagonist may not fit the stereotypical mold that you would normally find in a swords and sorcery book. But it is swords and sorcery, and I highly recommend it. One of my favorite standalones I've ever read. Okay, next up is science fantasy. Now, this is fantasy that really skirts the line between science fiction and fantasy. It's science fiction, I would call it adjacent. Even some of these books are science fiction, but they feel more fantasy. So I'm going to include one here. And obviously that's going to be the standalone, which is Dune by Frank Herbert. The original Dune. So it's a standalone for me because I think you should only read the original Dune book if you're looking for a science fantasy. The rest of the series is very much science fiction. The first Dune book feels a lot like a fantasy. Now, yes, there's spaceships and this person, and there's science involved in it, but everything else about it is very fantasy-like. There's a chosen one character, there's swords, there's big grand battles, there's a desert planet, which is very much fantasy. Let's be real here. There's kings and queens. There's emperors. There's noblemen. There's political intrigue. It's very much in the vein of a fantasy without too much like science-specific stuff that makes it feel like a science fiction, other than it takes place in space. And then for the series, we're going to go to another one that is generally considered science fiction, and that would be the Dragon Riders of Pern. Let's be real. It's dragons, there's sword fighting, there's wars, there's fighting, there's politics, there's kings and queens. This book is a fantasy, regardless of what Anne McCaffrey wants to say. The series does get more science fiction-y throughout it, but a lot of the series is mostly just dragon riding fantasy. And yeah, if you're looking for a Dragon Rider book, the series is perfect. It does have some science elements to it, such as one of the enemies is like this star, but they fight it in a fantasy way by riding dragons. It's very much science fantasy, in my opinion. Okay, the next subgenre we're going to talk about is cozy fantasy, which is a type of subgenre of fantasy that has started to get more prevalent and relevant in the past few years. Cozy fantasy is a fantasy that really focuses on the slice of life, everyday life of characters. It's usually lower stakes, and it's usually you can just read it and be comfortable. You don't have to worry about things, and it makes you smile. That's how I describe cozy fantasy. So the series I'm going to recommend for cozy fantasy is Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Fairies. Yeah, there's some stakes involved in the latter half of the series, but really the majority of these books is just cozy fantasy, slice of life stuff. I mean, the entire series takes place in a journal. She's writing down her everyday, day-to-day activities in a journal. That's how we read the series. And yeah, it's Emily Wilde studying fairies because she wants to write a book on them. That is the plot of the series. Don't know how else to say it, but it's very cozy. And for the standalone, I'm going to recommend The Night Circus by Erin Morgenstern. And this book is, again, about two wizards in their everyday life. And what are they doing? One's running a circus, the other is a performer in the circus. And yeah, they're battling each other, but the book is not about the battle. There's no real fights going on in the book. It's about everyday life and how they run the circus. It's very cozy, and there's a lot of moments that will make you smile in that book. Okay, and then we're going to talk. The next subgenre is short stories. So I'm going to recommend a short story collection here. These are just fantasy short stories, and I think the master of writing fantasy short stories is Jane Yolen. So she has released a bunch of different short story collections. They're all fantasy. The one I'm going to recommend is the Midnight Circus, and these are more of her darker, more epic fantasy short stories. It has like almost 20 short stories in the book, and for the most part, they're all good to great. Highly recommended if you like fantasy and are looking to check out a short story collection. Okay, the next subgenre we're going to talk about is literary fantasy. So in literary fantasy, it's not about the battles or the fights, even though those are present usually in literary fantasy. And it's not about the tropes. Usually the tropes are getting subverted in literary fantasy. What it's about is sort of the quest almost, but not in the same way as it is in high fantasy. It's about what our characters are going through and finding in the quest. And I think the best examples of this, books that I would recommend for fantasy, are the Witcher series by Andrzej Sapkowski. The Witcher series, there is a war going on, but we don't ever focus on the war. It's sort of just going on in the background. What we're focusing on is Geralt and Ciri and Yennefer and what they're learning and what they're going through during the course of the events of the series. It subverts a lot of tropes. It's not what you expect. It's very literary, but it's also a fantasy, if that makes sense. And then for the standalone, I'm going to recommend The Alchemist by Paulo Coelho. In this book, our main character is trying to go on a personal journey to make his legend, if that makes sense. But it's not about the journey or the quest or the fighting or the action. It's about really philosophy. That's what this book's about, philosophy. And yeah, it's just very, very, very literary. You can read it, and there's just some great quotes there and a lot of like learning moments in here. But it's not about really the story itself. It's about the character growing. Okay, the next subgenre we're going to talk about is dark academia. And in dark academia, we were focusing sort of on education and higher learning, but we're also doing it with like sort of gothic, dark vibes. But it has all the other classic things you love about fantasy, magic, secondary worlds, stuff like that. And the best two examples I have for this are, for standalone, I have Blood Over Brighthaven by M.L. Wang. This book's great. Really, it feels like you're in university or college, and that's what the entire book feels like, really. But there's also like super high stakes going on and really dark magic and sort of this gothic lens over the entirety of the book. I think it's the best example of dark academia in the fantasy market. Then for a series, we haven't really read any series that are purely dark academia. Well, really, The Magicians is, but I didn't like that one, so I would never recommend it. So what I'm going to recommend is The Poppy War by R.F. Kuang. And The Poppy War isn't really dark academia, but it is military academia, and it is still very dark. So I think it kind of fits the vibes you're looking for here, but not exactly. It's not gothic, really, at all. But yeah, the academia in the first book particularly is very good, and the book is very dark, so... Okay, and then next up, the next subgenre I'm going to talk about is heist fantasy. Now, this isn't like a real subgenre, but there's a lot of heist fantasy out there. So what it is it's a fantasy story that revolves around a heist. And the series I'm going to recommend is Six Crows by Leigh Bardugo. Now, why I'm going to recommend Six of Crows and not something like Mistborn or the Dresden Files is because both books in Six of Crows, the duology, they both have a heist in it. I think both heists are very good. I do think the heist in the first book's better, but I do think the second book is better overall. So keep that in mind. But two heists in a duology, both books centering around a heist, is pretty awesome. The character work here is superb. And I just really, really, really enjoyed the heists themselves. I thought the planning was good. I didn't think it seemed weird or faulty at all. And for the standalone, I am going to recommend The Sky on Fire by Jen Lyons. This is a dragon fantasy more so than a heist fantasy, but the main plot does revolve around a heist in which our main set of characters are trying to break into a dragon vault to steal something. I thought the heist here was very good, and I really enjoyed it, so I am recommending it as a heist fantasy. Okay, the next subgenre I'm going to talk about is historical fantasy. This is fantasy that's based on real-life history. That doesn't mean it has to take place in our real-life world. It could just be based on real-life history, but using fake lands and characters that you can pretty easily recognize as real history in our world, right? So that is what historical fantasy is, and it skirts the line between historical fiction and fantasy, but it's sort of just a genre blender, I would say. And for the series, I'm going to recommend the Warlord Chronicles by Bernard Cornwell. This is his King Arthur trilogy. And why it's a historical fantasy, in my opinion, is because it really captures the essence of the Dark Ages better than any King Arthur series or book has done. Usually these King Arthur books, they focus on the medieval ages. But King Arthur is actually a character from the Dark Ages. Now, King Arthur isn't obviously a real person, but his character does exist in the Dark Ages, not the medieval ages. And Bernard Cornwell nails Dark Ages in this book so well. Like, everything that could happen during the period that King Arthur was alive does happen in this book, and it's just more realistic and gritty, and borrows a lot from real life history, if that makes sense. And for the standalone, I'm going to recommend The Lions of Al Rassan by Guy Gavriel Kay. Now, this takes place in an entirely fictional world, unlike the Warlord Chronicles, which takes place in England. This takes place in a fictional version of Spain, but it has a different name. None of the people are real people. They're based on real people, but they're not real people. And there is a little bit of magic going on in this series, which obviously doesn't happen in real Spain. But in this series, we have a character and a culture that represents the Christians. We have a character and culture that represents Judaism, and we have a character and culture that represents Islam. And it takes place in very much real-life Spain, and it references real-life events. And this book, the end of this book, will make you cry. It's so good, so powerful, and just like the perfect blend of real history and fantasy that I've ever seen. Okay, and then next up is Dragon Fantasy. And this, again, not really a real sole subgenre, because like Dragon Fantasies are going to cross subgenres at all times. But Dragon Fantasy is just fantasy that revolves around dragons, right? So there's a dragon in your story, and it's more than just like a side character, let's put it that way. So the two things that I'm going to recommend are for series, that would be Fourth Wing, or the Empyrean series by Rebecca Yarros. Yes, this is a romantasy, but the dragons carry the book a lot. I think the dragons in the series are just very, very, very fun characters, and they create some very, very fun magic and action. And yeah, I know this series isn't going to work for everybody, but for me, I really, really loved the dragons in the series, so I do recommend it if you're looking for a dragon fantasy. Plus, Onyx Storm last year was one of the biggest selling books of all time, and I think you're just missing out if you're not giving the series a shot. And for the standalone, I'm going to recommend The Ice Dragon by George R.R. Martin. Now, this is just a novella, but it's a great novella. It's George R.R. Martin. You may think this is related to A Song of Ice and Fire, but it's not. It takes place in an entirely different world with an entirely different set of characters. But yeah, it's great. It's very short, too. It's only like 100 pages. You can read it in a couple hours. It has some great artwork. And the dragon in it, it's the first. George says it's the first example of an ice dragon ever in fantasy. I don't know how true that is, but if it is true, he knocks it out of the park with it, 'cause the dragon in this book is awesome. Okay, next up is middle grade. So middle grade is fantasy for children, for ages 7 to 12 usually, or 5 to 12, depending on the publisher. So for the two book recommendations for the series, I'm going to recommend Percy Jackson and the Olympians by Rick Riordan. Great series, great action. These books are shorter in length. Obviously, they're all single point of view. Most middle grade books are just single point of view books. It's very trope heavy, but what I love about this book is it combines some great humor, some great action with some great education. And I just think Greek mythology is fun. And I think this book series can be read by people of all ages. And honestly, should be read by people of all ages. And for the standalone, I am going to recommend The Grace of the Wild Things by Heather Fawcett. This is a standalone middle grade fantasy with a lot of humor, and it is a retelling of Anne of Green Gables with witches. Don't know how else it gets any better than that. Awesome series, great humor. I flew through this book when I read it. Love it. And I read this recently, so you can read this at any age. It works. Just such a great book. Okay, the next subgenre I'm going to talk about is young adult. And this is typically for ages like 13 through 18. And generally, young adults are more trope heavy, but they usually have more than one point of view. They don't always have more than one point of view. Sometimes they're single point of view, but compared to middle grade, you'll find a lot more books with multi-point of view. They're usually a bit longer, but they're not as dark, and they're more trope heavy, and usually more light. And the two books that I'm going to recommend for the series, I'm going to recommend Throne of Glass. Throne of Glass is awesome. I think Throne of Glass is one of the best fantasy series ever written. And it is very young adult, especially early on. Like books 1 through 3, well, books 0 through 3 are just super, super young adult. I think the books do age up into like new adult in the latter half of the series, like books 4 through 7. But they're still young adult in a way. Yeah, I can't recommend it enough. The character work here is superb. The world building here is very, very good. The action here is great. The storytelling is very good. It is very trope heavy. It is more hopeful. But don't get me wrong, there's still a lot of dark stuff in here, just not, I would say, like graphic violence. And the standalone that I'm going to recommend is Eyes of the Dragon by Stephen King. Who knew Stephen King wrote a young adult fantasy way back in the 80s? It's actually kind of crazy, but I think this fantasy book is actually just very, very good. I liked it from front to back. It has like definite Rapunzel almost vibes to it, in terms of where it drew its inspiration from. But it also has its own unique Stephen King flair and some really great action and just some really great character work. But yeah, it is definitely very young adult. So if you're like Stephen King, he writes only adult books. Not here. This book is very, very young adult. Okay, the next subgenre we're going to talk about is novellas. So yeah, fantasy novellas. So for novellas, they're just, shorter books basically. They're not full-length novels, but they're shorter than short stories or novelettes. Usually they're between like 40 to 60,000 words. And the two books that I'm going to recommend for series, I'm going to recommend The Crowns of Ischia series by Karen Loeche. The first book's called The Mountain Crown. These are 3 novellas. They're all very short. You can read each novella in like an hour and a half, maybe 2 hours tops. They're all just over 100 pages. And they're just dragon riding novellas. But what's great about it is in those 120 pages, he manages to do like some superb world building, some superb character work while building towards these great climaxes that involve political intrigue and action. And yeah, this is a dragon fantasy also, and the dragons here are very fun. And where fantasy really gets its bread and butter from novellas are standalones. And for me, I'm going to recommend The Emperor's Soul by Brandon Sanderson. It's everything you love about the Cosmere, its own unique magic system, great action, great character work, hopefulness to it in a shorter format, and he somehow manages to make it work. Some people even think it's their favorite Cosmere book, and I'm not going to argue with you if you think that. But that would be The Emperor's Soul. Just such a great book, and I highly recommend reading it. Okay, and finally, we are going to close it out with our last subgenre, and that would be classic fantasy. So this is fantasy that was written primarily in the 80s, 70s, 60s, or before that. There's not as much fantasy written before that, but yeah, you get the picture. Obviously, for series, we're going to recommend The Lord of the Rings. It's the original fantasy series. People still draw from Tolkien and Lord of the Rings today when they write. If you haven't read it, you should read it. Don't get me wrong, it's a bit hard to read, especially the beginning of Fellowship, but it's really worth sticking through it and reading it all because the character work and some of the plot points and the world are just brilliant. And for standalone, I'm going to recommend The Little Prince by Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. I can never say that name. But yeah, this is a classic standalone. It is a middle grade fantasy, but really it's written for all ages. It's about a little prince who has landed on Earth and he is trying to figure out how to get back home. And while that does sound science fiction-y, it's not. It's just a pure fantasy. Trust me, it's not science fiction-y in the slightest, but it has great lessons, great humor, and like an end that is sort of left in question. Like, we don't exactly know what happened at the end, but it requires some critical thinking, and it is quite sad. And that is every subgenre of fantasy that we were going to talk about today. This was really fun. Every book I recommended here are among my favorite fantasy books that I've ever read. They're all great. And if you haven't read a specific subgenre and you're looking for it, I hope you check out some of the books I recommended. Let me know down below what your favorite subgenre of fantasy is, or what subgenre you haven't read yet, or what books you disagree with that I recommended. And as always, thank you for watching.